Good evening. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel. My name's Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first virtual event with us, welcome. Thank you for being here. If it's your 7th or 18th, welcome back. Thanks so much for your continued support of the Majors and Quinn events program in all the forms it's taken over the past couple of years. We cannot put these on without you being here to watch them, so thank you. I'm very pleased to be presenting author Renée Branum, who's going to talk about her brand new novel, Defenestrate, and of course she's going to be in conversation with Charles Baxter. I'm going to put links to how to purchase Defenestrate on the Majors and Quinn website into the chat. Speaking of the chat, that is where you should put your questions for Renée and Charles. You can put them down there at any point during the broadcast. If you're watching on Facebook, you should put them in the comments. And if you're watching on YouTube, you should put them in the live chat. Either way, we'll see them and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the hour here. Until then, also feel free just to chime in, let us know where you're watching from, say hi, and I will remind you every so often to get your questions ready. I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and then we'll get going with a little reading from Renée here. First off, we have, of course, Renée Branum, who has an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the University of Montana and an MFA in Fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was a Truman Capote Fellow. Her work has appeared in the Georgia Review, Narrative Magazine, the Gettysburg Review, Brevity, and Alaska Quarterly Review, among others, and she has received 2 Pushcart nominations. She lives in Cincinnati. Renée, thanks so much for being here. And we also have tonight Charles Baxter, the author of the novels Feast of Love, nominated for the National Book Award, First Light, Saul and Patsy, Shadow Play, The Soul Thief, The Sun Collective, and the story collections Believers, Griffin, Harmony of the World, A Relative Stranger, There's Something I Want You to Do, and Through the Safety Net. His stories have appeared in several anthologies, including Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, the O. Henry Prize Story Anthology, and he has won the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story. And of course, Charles Baxter lives here in Minneapolis, one of our favorite local authors. Thanks so much for doing this tonight, Charles, and I am so looking forward to hearing from the two of you. But for now, we're going to get Renée up here to read a little bit from Defenestrate.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thanks for having me. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book, so I really don't have to do too much setting up, but the book is in short titled vignettes, and I'm going to read the first 3 vignettes of the novel. So this one's called Golden Years. When I picture the city now, I see it from overhead, bird's eye, a long, lonely aerial view looking down onto orange clay roof tiles curved like the shells of snails. The city shrinks, small enough to be covered with a palm. My palm, my twin brother's. We both seem to remember those years from above, as if we were often sailing out over the streets that opened up into squares. The ice skating rink, dusted blue, the high clock tower with its windows sealed shut, the bridge a long spine of black bone straining across the bread-colored water. And I guess it's true that the city rises, tiered, made up of slopes and heights, spires and columns and towers, all these high places you could climb to get a better view of things. And I guess it's also true that I was always climbing them. I remember once wandering home drunk and coming upon a bit of scaffolding along the back wall of a church and starting to climb it without even blinking. My brother was there too, but he didn't follow. He stood with his hands shoved into his coat pockets, whistling golden years and rocking forward and back on the balls of his feet. Always so careful, my brother. It's strange that eventually he was the one to fall. I stood up there with the frost in the air hitting me just right, so that the skin on my face came awake for a moment, and then my cheeks went all sleepy and numb, and there was a faintly greenish mist coming up off the snow that sat in gutters, tram lights glancing upward. Nick waited down below until finally he called up, "Hey sis, you get your kicks yet?" And I guess I had. I don't know what it was I hoped to see from up there, the streets getting smaller as though I was looking at it, through the wrong end of a telescope, the spires at the base of the hill poking holes in the tame, rounded skyline. I was always daring just a little too much in those days, putting space between myself and the ground, myself and safety, myself and my cautious, slope shouldered brother who was singing under his breath, "Don't let me hear you say, life's taking you nowhere, angel. Come, get up, my baby." The whole time I was climbing dizzily back down to him. The curse. There's a superstition in our family about falling, a kind of tight lipped joke that's no longer a joke because it's happened too often over the years. Cousins leaning against railings that wouldn't hold their weight, uncles losing their footing while cleaning leaf debris from slimy gutters, aunts toppling from ladders, their spines folding up on themselves like coat hangers. Something in our bodies wants to fall, blood magnetized to pavement, iron and concrete greeting each other across a stretch of air, the downward plunge and crack, like a pink Easter egg dropped from a window. We splinter that easily. We can trace it back a century or so, the story of our great great grandfather Jiří in Prague, who was said to give a gentle push the back of a Roma stonemason, where he stood placing chunks of limestone, smooth and flush, to form the bottom sill of a paneless window in a high church steeple. It was 1895, and there was a resurgence of new architecture, renovation, the city preening and polishing itself like a vast peacock with slate and granite and sandstone feathers. Jiří oversaw many of these building projects, gained a reputation for precision and efficiency. The stonemason, it was said, had seduced Jiří's youngest daughter, but who knew anymore if that was true? What was certain was that the stonemason landed below on rain-slick cobblestones, and his body bent into a hook, curving strangely like a treble clef. And according to legend, witnesses afterward reported that the body didn't bleed. No, they said, not even a trickle. I couldn't tell you what Jiří felt looking down at the question mark the stonemason's bloodless body made against the wet cobbles, the slice of October light that fell across him like a sash, whether our ancestor felt triumph or shame or a rage that still itched in his palms after the suddenness of the shove. But I can tell you that it was the end for him of his hard won reputation, the end of a long and respectable career, and he fled with his wife and children to the American Midwest, where he found work as a mule driver in a coal mine. It was there the family stayed, and there my brother and I grew up. The belief is that the stonemason's fall has somehow been handed down through the years, that for generations our family has held on to this death and never been forgiven. You could call it a curse, but that's a word we never seemed to use. It's only a story, our mother always told my brother and me, but I remember some nights her superstition would get the better of her, and she'd line the floor around our beds with pillows, tucking the blankets around our little bodies so that we struggled and thrashed after she switched off the lights, straining against our cocoons like Houdini escaping from a straitjacket. I think a part of me always longed for the fall. I know it's morbid, but I remember growing up with a kind of envy for that sweet, endless plummet, how your body can be given a measure of grace as it greets the air, feels its own heft and buoyancy. Some members of the family are so superstitious they will not go higher than the second floors of buildings, will keep far back from balcony railings or the sharp, sudden edges of hiking trails. But I've always dared more than the others, climbing up onto steeply pitched roofs, looking out at towering views with an arm slung loosely around a chimney, skirting close to ledges, daring my own weight to pull me down, daring a phantom push from behind, feeling the height lift through me all the way from feet to forehead. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a trapeze artist, a stunt pilot, a high dive champion, a female Evel Knievel. Your mother will not go for it, not a chance, my father said when I showed him a flyer for a circus camp when I was 8. Glossy pictures of arched bodies poised on high platforms, lifting their arms above their heads as if straining to get even higher before rising into the air like gaudy smoke, ruby sequins dusting the air with light. It's safe, I protested, showing him pictures of padded mats on the internet, showing him harnesses and cables. A year or so later, I showed my mother an article in National Geographic about cave divers. Now, don't you go getting any ideas, she said, shaking her head a little wildly, her earrings tinkling like tiny bells. She held me and I squirmed in her lap. She sniffed at my hair, and I imagined that it smelled like the high branches of elm trees, like sap and sunlight and too much air. We all make our way through a world of so much danger. I could never believe that our fear should be any greater than anyone else's. I didn't want to believe that my body would be asked to pay any consequence for the actions of a relation I'd never met, of whom not even a single photograph exists. Not that I couldn't imagine him. I felt at times that I knew his face, craggy and sunken eyed, heavily shadowed from the sight of the stonemason tumbling forward into all that air, swallowing gusts of it on the way down, and on the pavement below, his chest swollen with that huge final breath. Defenestrate. One thing the city of Prague is famous for: throwing men out of windows. The word for this is defenestration. Tourists can climb the narrow stairs to the room where Catholic noblemen were defenestrated because of a religious dispute in 1618. You can look down from the window to see exactly the length of their fall. Catholics say these men were saved by angels, cradled in the arms of the Virgin herself, lowered gently to earth. Protestants say the men survived because they landed in a dung heap piled below the window. Looking down from that window, it is easy to imagine an angel in the expanse between sill and cobblestones. Easier still to imagine a pile of shit, and easiest of all to conclude the city holds both of these in the loose clasp of its hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. There's so many questions that I want to ask you about this beautiful book. And I think it's fair to say that in some respects, it's a book that is very much haunted by the past and is conscious also of the way fiction in our time and the fiction that the narrator is creating is also mixed up with fact. There are many real life episodes, real life events in the book. But I think for people who haven't read the book, it's best to begin just by saying that the narrator is Marta, who is telling the story of herself and her relation to her twin, Nick, and the time that the two of them spent in Prague, and a certain amount of family history that comes into all of this. I don't think I'm giving too much away by saying that Nick, as we discover through the book, is gay, and that, as we learn also much more slowly, Marta has problems with substance abuse, particularly alcoholism. But there are other elements in the book that I think readers might not expect. One of them being a preoccupation with Buster Keaton, who in some ways is almost the third major character, the third major character in the novel. And the figure of Keaton is so beautifully integrated into the motifs of the novel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, I just wanted to say how Keaton found his way into your novel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've had Keaton on the brain for like a large part of my life.
Yeah.
And
As we were saying before we began, 10 years ago when you were in my workshop, you were writing about Buster Keaton.
I was, and I've been trying to sort of find an entry point for him into my fiction for many, many years. So I didn't sort of write this tale for him to be a figure to be a patron saint of falling, but I also sort of found that he fits so neatly into Marta's obsessions. And Marta is a narrator who fixates, and one of the things she fixates on is her family history and this idea of the falling curse. And I think for her and Nick, because Keaton has made a life and a livelihood and an art form out of falling, he serves as a figure for them, kind of safety and of transforming difficulty and like chaos into something that is beautiful. And so I think he served very neatly as well, I mean, it's an obsession I have that I shared with my character, really, is how I sort of transferred my own love of Keaton onto Marta and Nick. But it ended up being a really good fit, I think, for them as characters. Yeah.
People who are listening to us talk might think that the novel is obsessed only with people who have fallen and died. And that's not true, actually. The book is quite equally concerned with people who have fallen, sometimes from a great height, and survived. And the novel also mentions a famous shot in a Keaton movie where the side of a house falls over, and Buster Keaton is sitting in front of the house so that when the side of the house falls over, the window falls over him and he survives. I just saw that shot a week or so ago, and you mention it in the book. I just love that.
Oh my gosh. I was just reading in James Curtis's biography of Keaton about that shot, and apparently they actually built the front of the house around Keaton. And he was given on each shoulder a 2-inch clearance. So the window was
Unbelievable.
2 inches larger in every direction than and that was as much wiggle room as he had before he was severely injured. So off by 2 inches, and we might not have had any films after Steamboat Bill Jr. So.
Yeah, you say in the novel something that I didn't know, which was that the cameramen who were filming that shot couldn't stand to look at it. I don't know, is that true?
Yeah, yes, that is true. That many of the cameramen looked away. Apparently, there were women on the set who were fainting. I mean, some of those things sound apocryphal, but this biography that I just read is very meticulous about getting things correct, and he says that there were several cameramen who could not quite look at what was happening.
Yeah.
So
I don't want to leave the impression that your book is only about Keaton. It's very much about Marta and Nick and their mother, and it's also very much about Prague. And the way that Marta and Nick set up lives for themselves, for good and for ill, in that city. I wonder if you could talk a little bit just about Prague and the way that it figures in your novel. For me, it's a kind of a city haunted by history, and also a kind of dream world. But that may be just me.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I the way that I think about Prague is that there are some cities where you really do feel a strong sense that that the magic of the place is good or bad, but I feel like Prague's magic is just sort of permeatingly neither one. It's sort of just there's a sense of magic everywhere, but it's a very tangled magic. And I feel like it's that way for Nick and Marta in the novel, that it's a beautiful place, and it's connected to their ancestry, and so they feel a sort of sense of belonging there, but they also feel very lonely and very othered during their time there, as one often does in sort of a space where it's completely foreign from your experience and you don't speak the language. So yeah, I think it represents story for them, and it also represents a space for them to start over in, but of course they aren't free to completely start over, because it carries all these associations that are closely linked to their family history and to who they are as people, as members of this family, and as individuals.
Yeah, I want to ask you in relation to that a question that may not be all that easy to answer, but I have to say that in the readings that I've done of your novel, I've thought that one of its particular attractions, one of its great beauties, is the prose, which creates a kind of spell. It's a sort of spellbound novel, and I hope that is accurate to your intentions. And I don't know exactly what my question is, but it has to do with writing a book that, even though it uses both fictional and factual materials, is hoping to weave a spell for the reader that, in some sense, represents the way Marta lives in the world.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of storytelling being a spell, of language being a spell. And I think, primarily for me, this is a book about the tangled relationship we all have to storytelling. And it is a spell. And in some ways it saves us, and in some ways it sort of, links us to things that are difficult and that
Mm-hmm.
we want to
Yeah.
escape and that we want to rise above. And
Yeah.
Marta confronts a lot of sort of difficult truths about her family narrative, that I don't, want to spoil for those who haven't read it. But
Right.
yeah, so certainly it is sort of like I was saying about Prague. There's like a good and a dark magic um, to storytelling as well.
Did,
And yeah, I think
yeah. Did
spell
you
would get in that.
did you think when you were working on the book um, that you wanted Marta and Nick to be, I don't know how to say this, not exactly doubles of each other, but in some sense reflecting surfaces?
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
they're not. It's not as if these two characters are one character, but the relation between the two of them is just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the discovery that I made in making the characters twins. Was I wanted there to be confusion for Marta about um, where they overlap, where they intertwine, and the spaces where they are very separate. And I think for Nick, he navigates those separate spaces a little more easily than she does.
Mhm.
She, in many ways, wants to see them as a single entity, even though she sometimes feels a little bit smothered by their unity.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that also sort of speaks to the relationship between the family narrative, where you're always trying to understand how you're separate from the stories that have defined your identity, like what differentiates your own, individual identity from the collective familial identity. And I think Marta and Nick as twins are sort of a microcosm of that relationship.
Yeah, one of the images we have of them is that when they were born, let's see if I have this right. Nick, as a newborn, was holding on to the ankle of Marta.
Yes.
It's an image that sort of stays with you as you read through it, because they're both trying to differentiate themselves, and at the same time, they're absolutely devoted to each other.
Yes.
They're always keeping track of how the other one is doing, and Marta in particular, as we learned fairly early on, she makes a list of 5 or 6 things that she hopes Nick will get. And it's part of I think, the suspense of the novel to see if he gets any of them.
Yeah. Yes. And I think they're also things that she doesn't want to admit that she wants for herself. Like it's easier for her to want them for her brother than it feels like there's more at stake if she admits that she wants these things for herself too.
Yeah. Yeah. I when I was looking through the book most recently, I marked a passage. It's on page 29. And through the miracle of Keaton, this is what I've come to know, to believe. The thing I always wanted to tell Nick, but could never find the words for, this naked fact that disaster is so often our only path to grace. It's a great sentence. And I don't know, were you thinking of that, disaster is our only path to grace, as something that would follow through the novel? I don't know. I guess I want you to talk about
Yeah.
that.
I think that Keaton is a wonderful artist in that he sort of begs just limitless, rich interpretation. And because he was a silent film comedian, and because he also didn't really consider himself an artist and didn't really talk about his work as as if it were an art form, that we're sort of constantly, I guess by we, it's like Keaton enthusiasts. We Keaton enthusiasts are like putting words to like what he was up to, and what his aesthetic sort of encapsulates. And I think that this is a moment where Keaton's preoccupation with disaster yielding beauty and yielding comedy and yielding just aesthetic delight coincides completely with Marta's sort of in the part that I was reading earlier, her longing for the fall, that she finds an aesthetic beauty in risk and in chaos and in her family story. But that this idea that you can only have grace, you can only have the beauty by going through the disaster, is a sort of difficult truth for her to swallow and process. And I think Keaton helps her and Nick in that. And this is a moment that, that her aesthetic and Keaton's really do coincide. So,
The one other movie or filmmaker I thought of while I was reading your book, in addition to Keaton, of course, was that very strange Alfred Hitchcock movie, Vertigo.
yeah.
And I mean, that film is partly about the vertigo suffered by the main character, Jimmy Stewart, which is both the fear of falling and the attraction of falling.
Mhm.
And that is, and I think that tension is very much in your book. That as supposedly, I have heard from psychologists that people who suffer from fear of heights are, in some sense, not so much afraid of falling, but afraid of their desire to fall.
Yeah.
Um, and it's in your book, it's in that movie, and also in Vertigo. There's the sense of falling, as in falling in love,
Mhm.
which can be a spiral into a sort of craziness, as it is in that movie.
Mhm.
Um, and and so when I was reading your book, I thought these characters are as attracted by falling as they are afraid of it. And it's that tension that is kept up all the way through the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And um, I think that on some level that the Vertigo sort of cathedral scenes kind of served a
Mm-hmm.
little bit as, I mean, I didn't really think about it until you mentioned in an email that my book made you think of Vertigo, and I was like, oh my gosh, that I feel like that could, like the church spire. I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh yeah, it's in there.
It is.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that there are moments in the book where I think Marta feels very much in control of her attraction to falling, and she feels that it's something she can manage, that it's something she can control. And then there are other moments where she is faced with the reality that no, in fact, these death drives, these dark moments are tugging at her in ways that she does not have a handle on. Um, and that's something that she also sort of projects onto Nick. And she says, um, Nick is not managing his attraction to the darkness of falling in a good way. But the book sort of reveals that they both have different ways of managing their fears and their obsessions. Sometimes those coincide and sometimes they do not. But I think for both of them, they're very present. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that both of them see beauty and darkness in, the sort of vertigo effect of
Yeah.
wanting to fall and dreading the fall. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things I think that gives the book its complexity and its beauty. It's very hard at any one point in the novel um, to say, uh, "Oh, I'm sure these characters are going to be fine." Uh,
Yeah.
you, um, until you come to the last few pages, you're just not sure how things are going to play out. There's also another character in the book who's very interesting, and that's well, I want to ask you briefly about Marta and Nick's parents. Um, we don't see much of their father, but there's a very interesting way that the father is presented as a man who's in love not with falling, but with miniatures,
Mm. Yes.
tiny things, models, model trains, and there's a wonderful. Uh, One of the things I love about this book are the digressions, and there's a digression about micro minor. I can't even say it. Micro miniaturization.
Mhm.
Um, and can you talk a little bit about that? Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. So Well, I cheated a little bit because my dad actually my own father loves miniatures, and he
Oh.
loves train layouts.
Mhm.
But yeah, when I was in Prague, one of the first museums that I sort of walked into off the street was this miniature museum that's described in the book, where miniatures to the extent that it's literally like, a figure on the edge of a grain of rice. Like it's infinitely small. And I think the characters in the book are really preoccupied. Well, particularly Marta is really preoccupied with this idea of perspective, and that like um, when you look at something that's really, really small, you feel massive in a way that like the city makes you feel tiny when you're wandering
Mhm.
around in it, but that
Mhm.
it's all sort of a matter of managing scale. That you can sort of feel like that you loom large in the lives of people close to you when they feel smaller. And that, yeah, that there's an attraction to the tininess of things because you feel centrally positioned within it. And actually, when I was revising this book, my editor pointed out to me that I used the word tiny like 4 times on my page.
Yeah,
So we
yeah,
cut it out. We cut out a lot of tiny throughout
yeah,
um, while we were working on this. But yeah, Marta is obsessed with that idea of tininess, and her father imparts both a love of Keaton and this love of scale. And the mother is sort of the one who's responsible for the family narrative. So both parents, even though the father is a little bit more sidelined and a little bit more passive, but both do sort of contribute to like the lore that the twins appreciate and that they kind of formulate into their identity. So
yeah. It occurs to me, thinking about what you're saying about miniatures and Prague, that both of your characters are um, struggling in a way to, um, I don't want to say grow up, but that there's a way that they are, and this often interests me in fiction when characters find themselves, for one reason or another, stuck in a particular kind of identity or mode or a haunting that has been created by their family. And it almost takes a disaster, some kind of explosion to get them unstuck, and that will allow them to grow and to become the people they want to become.
yes, very much so. Yeah.
Uh, and we haven't talked about the other major character in the book, which is Marta and Nick's mother.
Hmm.
What a great character! But in some ways, she begins as a kind of antagonist. What I want to say about her, without giving too much of the novel away, is that in her own way, um, she's, in certain respects, Marta and Nick are in this world, the one we inhabit, but they are also haunted, and to some extent, they're they're possessed by dream worlds. Um, and it may be fair to say also that in a very different way, their mother is too. She wants to impose her way of thinking on them.
She does.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think the difficulty is that the difficulty for Nick and Marta is that their mother their mother really sees religion as a literal truth. Um, Even though she understands in so many other contexts the value of storytelling being kind of flexible, and that there's sort of an art to mythology, and that
Yeah.
you don't have to believe everything literally in order to derive truth from it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the difficulty of believing, very literally in religious doctrine is that it becomes very rigid, and it becomes very rigid for Marta and Nick's
Mhm.
mother.
Yeah.
Um, but it's, without spoiling too much of the plot, it is also wrapped up in like in the grief of her family sort of unraveling instantaneously, and how that sort of manifests for her. And I I I do feel like for the first, maybe like even 2/3 of the novel, she's a very unlikable character. But,
Hmm.
but I had a friend of mine who said after reading the book and having a really sort of, kind of rigid religious mother, and he said, "Your book made me, like, forgive everything of my mother raising me with, like, this
Uh,
very rigid
yeah.
religious upbringing." And I
Yeah.
was like, "That's really powerful," and that's
Yeah.
um, that's very, a strong recommendation
Yeah.
for the character of the mother. So,
I I think so. I think so. Often in these gatherings, there are other writers, would-be writers, writers who are in writing programs, and I think they're often interested to know when a book like yours comes out, which is essentially, I think, a kind of lyric novel. Uh, what, if you don't mind talking about this, uh, what was easiest for you in writing this book, and what was hardest for
mm,
you
yeah,
in writing it?
it's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, this was in some ways the easiest book I've ever produced. I have another novel on the back burner that I've been working on for 7 years, and I wrote
Mm.
this in closer to 7 months. Probably start to finish, I wrote it in 9 months,
Wow.
at least the initial draft that I sent to, my editor. Um but yeah, I mean, I think the things that were easy were, uh, the character of Marta. She spoke really loud to me. She
Mhm.
spoke very clearly. I felt like I had a strong connection to her, and that, like, um, I could hear her voice very clearly in my mind. Um, I think I think the vignettes really helped me to sort of navigate through the story, through the telling of the story. But that's sort of also what was most difficult, was the way things are pieced together and what follows what, you know? It's a fragmented telling, and Marta is scattered in her narration, and she's evasive in her narration. So fitting things together in the ways of like a patchwork quilt, and the way that the squares all fit together to create a pattern, that was difficult.
Yeah.
And that created it required a lot of time and attention.
Yeah.
But the characters were there, and Prague was there, and Buster was there, and those things I think really fed, and fueled the big picture of the novel for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. My former student, Dean Bacopoulos, uh, who teaches at Grinnell now, has given a talk about what he calls the dramatization of contemplation. And another phrase from the talk he's given is the transformative, melancholic image. Uh, uh, and I thought of these phrases when I was thinking about your book. I think it would be worth saying to the people who are watching this that most of the book is written in relatively short chapters, and it is and it is not linear. That these chapters go wherever Marta more or less wants to take them, but there's a kind of unity of imagery and emotion that runs through it. I once found myself years ago talking to a student who didn't like plot. And I said, well, if you don't like plot, why don't you try writing using a kind of unity of imagery that runs through your novel or your story? And that kind of made sense to her. And I thought of that while I was reading Defenestrate, that there's a kind of unity of feeling in it. That's not to say that all the feelings are alike, but that there's a sort of emotional logic to the book that I would have thought would have been very hard to do.
Well, I love that because I've always been a little bit plot shy, and I feel like I feel like you know, when I took your seminar at Iowa, you won me over a little bit to plot. I was seeing sort of the magic of plot. But I love how sympathetic you are to someone who's plot shy and saying, let's think about unity of image and unity of theme and unity of and you know, Marta sort of meditating cyclically on the ideas of family narrative, of Keaton, of her sort of preoccupation with her brother's mental health and their time in Prague together. Um, these things sort of do add up to a plot somehow, magically, but but yeah, I think because she is looking non-linearly at her experience, it makes sense to sort of reflect that in the way things are broken up on the page.
Yeah. I don't know. It seems to me that if you're not going to have a linear plot that goes from A to B to C, there's often a question that the story or the novel is asking that will sustain the vignettes or whatever they are. And I don't know if you would agree with me, but the question that I think Defenestrate keeps asking is, how do we go on living?
Yeah.
How do we manage? How do we get from day to day, despite the disasters, the pratfalls, the catastrophes that fate and heredity have handed us?
Yeah. I mean, that's the heart of it for sure. And I think Marta asked the question sort of early on in the book when um she's remembering her brother asking her, I can't remember how I phrased it exactly, but like, isn't it strange that we're here? You know?
Yeah,
And what he's actually saying is, isn't it strange that we exist as minds in a body on the planet?
yeah,
Not just isn't it strange that we're in Prague or that we're in the American Midwest or, you know, wherever we are, but isn't it strange that we're in the world and that we have to navigate that? And that the project of the book for Marta in some ways is can I make it work? You know,
mhm,
like, can I make it work as a person, as a member of a family, as a sibling? Um, and and the answer is for her, yes, but barely, you know?
just barely,
Yeah.
just barely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. While you're reading the novel, you think this is a woman who actually is hanging on for dear life.
Yes. And you were talking about how you really love, what did you say? That you love stories where, a character is sort of unraveling?
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was certainly something that I was thinking about for Marta.
Yeah.
You're not fully aware of the extent to which she's unraveling until maybe halfway through the book. And then
half to 2/3 of the way through. I
Mhm.
think the way that I used to talk about it was the undoing of
Yes.
a character, how somebody is undone in the course of a story. I have one eye on the clock, and I don't know, Annie, whether there are questions.
Yeah, we have 2 questions so far from Kristen and Abby. So we can get to those if you want to do one more, maybe. And then we'll open it up to the questions we already have in the chat. And then anyone else, if you haven't put your question in, do it right now.
Well, I've asked most of my questions, and since we have 10 minutes until 8 o'clock, it might be good to open it at
All
this
right.
point.
Well,
Absolutely.
I'll start off with this question from Kristen. That's for you, Renee. What inspired you to write the book? Did you start with the character, or Prague as a place, or premise, or mood? And she says, looking forward to reading it.
Yeah, Kristen, thank you for asking. I would say the short answer to your question is the book started with Prague. I wrote a very brief lyric essay about living in Prague as an expat that were the very first seeds for this novel. And that started as a nonfiction piece, but I think I felt the seeds for a voice within that piece, that a voice that was above and beyond my own, that was the voice of Marta, my narrator. And once I sort of started to feel her speak through my experiences, I kind of landed upon this idea of the family curse. So I think it started with Prague, and then the second sort of foundation to fall in place was character, and the story sort of arose from those two pieces, those two cornerstones.
Yeah, thank you. And then from Abby, sort of a similar theme, I guess. The idea of defenestration conjures up a very specific place and time, very much as described in your vignette. Was that image with you from the beginning, or did it come about from the characters? So when you started with Prague, did its association with defenestration
Yeah.
that?
Yes. Defenestration was very present in my writing of Prague from the beginning. I really was attracted to this idea of a sort of historical legacy based around um, being thrown out of windows, and I was sort of attracted to how chaotic and like sort of formalizing chaos, I think, was what was happening in Prague in the 1600s. Is like there was a form of execution that arose from something that was completely like sort of barbaric, but that it in the context it was sort of the acceptable, like, this is what, the royals do to one another when they can't get along. And and so I don't know, I think that that spoke to my experience of Prague, that it was very sort of beautifully measured and like, yeah, like gorgeously historic and ornate, but that there was also sort of an edge of unpredictability behind it that was sort of magical.
It's also, I think, noticeable when you're in Prague that it is a landscape that has been invaded many times.
It has, yes.
So that history, it's a place where history has not been forgotten,
Yeah.
where the past is very much alive
Hmm.
wherever you go in that city.
And you kept using the word haunted, that
Mhm.
the characters are very haunted. And Prague is a very haunted space because
Yeah.
it's seen so much. It's suffered a lot. It's experienced a lot. And so, yes, like it's full of ghosts, as we say. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
For sure.
Well, we have a new question here. Is Marta still in your head, Renee? Do you keep thinking of more story and musings for this character, or is a completely new book on your mind now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like Marta really did speak her piece in this book, but I do sort of sometimes meditate on different sort of members of the family tree. Sometimes I think about distant cousins of Marta from the past, and I sometimes think about potentially telling their stories. Um, I was thinking uh, I was thinking briefly about like another set of twins, a female male set of twins from like the 50s. Um, but you know, Marta is with me in that, like, she and I went through the whole writing of a book together. So yeah, she's with me in that way. Um, but yeah, I definitely still inhabit the space of the family sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I get to watch so many of these, and every author is different. Some, it's like the writing of the character is like sort of an exorcism. Like once they're done, they're out, and some stay with them forever. So here's a new question from David. How much did the Old Testament influence the genesis of the novel, Fall of Adam and Eve, etc., if at all?
Yeah, well, the mother of the narrator and her twin brother is so preoccupied with the Old Testament and the New. She's a devoted Catholic lady. So there is a section in the book that talks specifically about the fall and the fall from grace, and it is on Marta's mind because she grew up thinking about it, and it's something that preoccupies the mother. I don't write. There are a few sections throughout, a few vignettes where I make specific biblical references, but it's less prevalent than Buster Keaton. So it's it's like Keaton is the twins' Bible, and the Bible is their mother's Bible, is the way that I would sum it up. Yeah.
Renee, while you were working on this book, was there any novel that you felt was a sort of model for what you wanted to do?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was reading a lot of books that were in the vignette form and that
Mhm.
were really using the vignette structure in a way that was sort of narratively um, imposed, that the structure was serving the narrative. And I think that one of those books that is probably one of the most brilliant examples of vignette novel is Mrs. Bridge by Evan S. Yeah.
Yes,
And
yes,
and I mean, I think my narrator is very different from the protagonist of that book, Mrs. Bridge, but he is using the vignettes as sort of a container for her experience. And in her case, she's a rather repressed character. So the vignettes sort of give these snapshots of life that she can't really see the full um, context for. She sort of has blinders on as she goes about her day to day. But similarly, Marta does not want to look at the whole picture all at once. So that was a major
yeah,
inspiration for
yeah,
me and a brilliant book.
yeah. I love that book. I think it's given permission to a lot of writers to
Yeah.
write in the way that they would actually like to write.
Yeah, cannot recommend Mrs. Bridge more highly
Yeah,
for those who have not read it.
yeah, yeah.
So,
All right. Well, great. Great questions, everyone. We have just another thank you for you here, Renee, that the vignettes that you read were spellbinding. So Great choice. Reading from
Thanks.
the beginning. Yeah, and if anyone missed the live viewing of this event, the video stays available on the Majors and Quinn Facebook page and YouTube channel, so you can send people that way if they weren't able to watch tonight. And just one reminder that in the chat already is a link to the Majors and Quinn website directly to the page with Defenestrate on it. We do have the copies that are on our shelves right now have signed book plates from Renee. So thanks for sending those along, and get them while we have them. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming. Thanks so much, Annie. Thank you, Charlie. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.